The silence on the 40th floor didn't just exist, it breathed. For 6 months, Elias Thorne had lived in a vacuum of his own making. No phone calls, no television, no voice, just the rhythmic ticking of a heart that felt like a clock counting down to a deadline that never arrived. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, Seattle was a smear of gray sleet and freezing rain, a city of millions that Elias had successfully deleted from his reality. He was a ghost in a glass box, a retired cleaner, for people who didn't exist, living on a pension of blood money and regret. Then came the knock. It wasn't the heavy boot thud of a hitman or the frantic rapping of a neighbor. It was light, deliberate, almost rhythmic. Elias didn't move. He watched the security feed. A young black woman stood in the hallway, her cheap yellow parka dusted with melting snow. She wasn't holding a weapon. She was holding a small velvet box, the kind that holds a lifetime of promises. When Elias finally opened the door, the cold air hit him first, and then her voice, the first human sound he'd heard in half a year. But it wasn't what she said that stopped his heart. It was what she held. An Patek Philippe wristwatch worth more than the building they stood in, and it was covered in fresh, wet blood. The screen fades to black as the ticking of a watch grows louder. We go back to where it all began. Elias Thorne's apartment was a masterpiece of minimalism and paranoia. Every piece of furniture was bolted down. Every window was reinforced. There were no photos on the walls because Elias didn't want to remember who he used to be. He was 54 years old, but his hands moved with the predatory grace of a man half his age. He spent his mornings cleaning a Glock he never intended to use and his afternoons staring at the sound, watching the fairies cut through the fog like slow-moving memories. He had been the janitor for the Van Eyck syndicate. When a deal went sideways or a witness needed to vanish, Elias was the one who swept the floor. He had retired after a job in Prague that left him with a limp and a conscience he couldn't quiet. The deal was simple. He kept their secrets and they let him breathe. But breathing wasn't the same as living. He hadn't spoken because he was afraid that if he opened his mouth, the names of the dead would come tumbling out. Downstairs 3 blocks away, Zora Vance worked the graveyard shift at the Rusty Anchor. She was 24, a nursing student by day and a waitress by night. She noticed the man in 4002 because he was the only regular who never ordered. Every Friday at 3 a.m. he would sit in the corner booth, drink black coffee, and leave a $100 bill. He never looked her in the eye. He never said thank you. But she saw his hands. They were the hands of a surgeon or a killer, steady, scarred, and lonely. One night the man didn't show up. Then a week passed. Then a month. Zora found herself looking up at the high rise on the hill, seeing that single light on the 40th floor. She didn't know why she cared. In Seattle, caring was a luxury most couldn't afford. But Zora had been raised by a grandmother who taught her that a man who drinks his coffee in silence is either carrying a prayer or a curse. Zora was closing up when she found the watch under the corner booth. It wasn't just left behind. It was tucked into the cushion, hidden. And when she picked it up, she realized the second hand wasn't moving. It was stuck, jammed by a tiny jagged piece of human bone. Wind howls through the speakers as we return to the doorway of apartment 4002. Elias stared at the watch in Zora's hand. He recognized it instantly. It belonged to Victor Van Eyck, the man who had signed Elias's retirement papers with a silver pen and a threat. To anyone else it was a luxury timepiece. To Elias it was a mark. In the syndicate, if your watch was delivered to someone it meant you were dead and the recipient was next. "You shouldn't be here," Elias said. His voice was a rusted hinge, cracking under the weight of the first words he'd spoken in months. Zora didn't flinch. She was shivering, her boots leaking slush onto his pristine hardwood. "I found it at the diner. Your booth. I saw the blood and I thought you were hurt." "I haven't been to that diner in 3 months," Elias replied, his mind already calculating trajectories. If the watch was at the diner, it meant the Van Eycks knew his routine. It meant they had killed Victor, a power struggle, and the new regime was clearing the books. "Someone put it there for me to find," Zora whispered, the realization dawning on her. "They watched me watch you. They used me as a courier because they knew you wouldn't shoot a girl in a yellow parka." Elias grabbed her arm and pulled her inside, slamming the door. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the hallway camera feed on his phone. A black SUV was idling at the curb 40 floors below. The silence of his life was gone, replaced by the high-pitched hum of adrenaline. He had tried to bury the janitor, but the janitor was the only one who could keep this girl alive now. "Why did you come?" he asked, his voice gaining its old lethal edge. "You saw blood. You should have called the police." "The police don't come to my neighborhood for blood," Zora said, her voice trembling but her eyes holding his. "And I didn't want you to die alone in this glass cage." As Elias reached for the watch, a red laser dot appeared on the velvet box, then drifted upward, settling directly over Zora's heart. The sound of a heavy curtain closing. Darkness. Floor. Elias roared, throwing his weight into Zora. They hit the hardwood just as the reinforced glass of the balcony shattered. It wasn't a spray of shards. The bullet was high velocity, designed to punch through the tempered layers Elias had installed. He didn't wait for a second shot. He dragged Zora into the kitchen, behind the reinforced granite island. "Stay down. Don't breathe. Don't move." Elias reached under the sink, pulling a hidden release. A panel slid back, revealing a bag packed years ago. It contained 3 passports, 50,000 in cash, and a suppressed subcompact pistol. He wasn't the janitor anymore. He was a target. "Who are they?" Zora gasped, her face pressed against the cold stone. "People who don't believe in retirement," Elias said. He checked the hallway camera again. The elevator was moving. Someone had the service key. He had 4 minutes, maybe 3. He looked at Zora. She was the only clean thing in his life, and now she was covered in the dust of his broken windows. "I'm sorry," he whispered. It was the most honest thing he'd said in a decade. "Don't be sorry," she snapped, her survival instinct finally overriding her shock. "Be fast." Elias took the watch from the box. He smashed the casing against the counter. Inside, nestled beneath the gears, was a micro SD card. Victor hadn't just died. He'd sent Elias the insurance policy, the digital ledger of every politician, judge, and cop on the Van Eck payroll. This wasn't just a hit. This was a scorched earth policy. The elevator dinked. The sound echoed through the silent apartment like a gunshot. Elias raised his weapon, but it wasn't a hitman who stepped out. It was a 12-year-old boy, holding a burner phone that started to ring. The ringing of the phone fades into the sound of a heartbeat. The boy didn't move. He stood in the wreckage of the living room, the freezing wind whipping his thin jacket. Elias kept the gun leveled, his finger a hair's breadth from the trigger. "Answer it," the boy whispered, his eyes wide with a terror that looked practiced. Elias grabbed the phone. "Talk." "Hello, janitor," a voice purred. It was Julian Van Eck, Victor's younger, more sadistic brother. "I see you've met Zora. And now you've met Leo. Leo's mother is currently sitting in a car with a man who has very little patience. You have the card." "I want the card." "The girl goes, the boy goes, and the mother goes," Elias said, his voice flat. "Then we talk." "No," Julian laughed. "The girl stays with you. Consider her your final witness." "I'm coming up, Elias. I want to see the look in your eyes when I finish what the Prague job started." Elias hung up. He looked at Zora, then at the boy. The trap was perfect. If he fled with Zora, the boy's mother died. If he stayed, they all died. He had spent his life solving problems for monsters, and now he had to solve one for himself. "Zora, take the boy," Elias commanded. "There's a freight elevator behind the kitchen. It leads to the basement garage. Take the blue sedan. The keys are in the visor." "What about you?" Zora stood up, her jaw set. "You're not coming, are you?" "I have to clean the room, Zora. It's what I do." Zora grabbed his hand. "You told me you didn't want to be that person anymore." Elias looked at the blood-stained watch on the floor. "I'm not doing it for them this time. I'm doing it for you." He pushed her toward the elevator just as the front door exploded. The sound of an explosion muffled by a thick wall. The apartment, once a sanctuary of silence, became a theater of violence. Elias Thorne moved through the shadows with the ghost memory of 1,000 battles. He didn't use the gun yet. He used the environment. He had rigged the apartment for this day, though he'd prayed it would never come. Julian's men entered in a tactical stack. They were young, arrogant, and loud. Elias took the first one in the kitchen, using a piano wire garrote he'd hidden behind the spice rack. No sound. Just the heavy slump of a body. He was a shadow among shadows. He moved through the dining room, his limp vanishing under the surge of adrenaline. He was 54, but in the dark he was eternal. He took the second man with a kitchen knife, a precise strike to the femoral artery. But Julian wasn't a fool. He stayed in the hallway, flanked by his two best shooters. I know you're in there, Elias. I can smell the mothballs and the regret. Elias leaned against the wall, blood dripping from his hand. He was tired. Not just physically but deep in his marrow. He looked at the shattered glass, the city lights shimmering in the sleet. He thought about Zora. He thought about the way she'd looked at him, not as a monster but as a man who was drowning. The card is in the safe, Julian. Elias shouted, his voice echoing. Come and get it yourself. He wasn't going to the safe. He was going to the gas line. Julian stepped into the apartment, a gold-plated Desert Eagle in his hand. He stepped over his dead men without a glance. He pointed the gun at the shadow in the corner. End of the line, janitor. But the shadow wasn't Elias. It was a decoy made of a coat and a floor lamp. While the apartment burned above, Zora was driving. The boy Leo was silent in the back seat, clutching a backpack. Zora's hands were white on the steering wheel. She was a nursing student. She was supposed to heal people, not flee from assassins in a stolen Lexus. Is he coming? Leo asked. He's coming, Zora said, lying to the boy and herself. She pulled into a crowded parking lot at Seattle-Tacoma Airport. Elias had told her to go to the locker 412. Inside, she found a second bag and a note. Go to the authorities in D.C. Not Seattle. The names on the card will protect you if you use them right. Don't look back. Zora sat in the car, the engine idling. She looked at the micro SD card. It was so small. A sliver of plastic that cost so many lives. She thought about Elias Thorne, the man who hadn't spoken for 6 months because he was saving his breath for this. She realized then that he wasn't just cleaning. He was balancing a ledger. Every life he saved tonight was a payment for a life he'd taken in the past. But she didn't want him to be a martyr. She wanted him to be the man who ordered black coffee and stayed a little too long just to be near someone. A hand knocked on the car window. Zora screamed, reaching for the gun Elias had given her. But it wasn't a hitman. It was Leo's mother, trembling and bruised, holding a phone. He told me to find the blue car, she sobbed. He said he'd settled the debt. The sound of a plane taking off, drowning out everything. Back at the penthouse, the air was thick with the smell of gas and expensive scotch. Julian Van Eck stood in the center of the room, his men dead around him. Elias emerged from the shadows of the balcony, his coat torn, his face a mask of blood and soot. Where is it? Julian demanded, leveling his gun. It's gone, Julian. The girl has it. The boy is safe. The mother is free. Elias stood tall, his limp gone, his eyes reflecting the fire starting to lick at the curtains. You'll die for a waitress? Julian sneered. A girl who doesn't even know your real name? She knows enough, Elias said. She knew I was worth a knock on the door. Elias didn't reach for his gun. He reached for the lighter in his pocket. It was an old Zippo, a gift from a woman in Prague he'd failed to save. The Van Eck name ends tonight, Elias said. I'm the janitor. And I'm finally finished with the job. Julian fired. The bullet caught Elias in the shoulder, spinning him back. But Elias didn't drop the lighter. He flicked it. The flame was small, orange, and beautiful. For Zora, he whispered. The explosion didn't just shatter the windows. It leveled the entire top floor. From the street, it looked like a star had fallen into the heart of Seattle. In the chaos, a single figure was seen falling toward the water, cloaked in fire and shadow. The sound of waves crashing against a pier. 3 months later, Washington, D.C. was cold, but a different kind of cold than Seattle. It was a city of stone and secrets. Zora Vance sat on a bench outside the Department of Justice, watching the cherry blossoms struggle to bloom against the late frost. The Van Eck syndicate was gone. The SD card had triggered a federal sweep that took down senators, precinct captains, and the remaining Van Eck cousins. Zora had been the star witness. They called her a hero. She felt like a ghost. She still had the watch. She'd had it repaired. The second hand moved now. A steady click-click-click that reminded her of a heartbeat. She stayed in a safe house. She finished her degree. But every time someone knocked on her door, she held her breath, hoping for a man with scarred hands and a silent voice. She walked into a small diner on the outskirts of the city. She sat in the corner booth and ordered black coffee. She didn't drink it. She just watched the door. "Is this seat taken?" The voice was low, rasping. It sounded like it had been through fire and came out stronger. Zora looked up. The man standing there had a new face, the work of a very expensive surgeon, and a prosthetic arm hidden under a heavy coat. But his eyes were the same. He looked at the coffee, then at her. "I hear the meatloaf here is terrible," he said. The sound of a coffee cup being set on a saucer. They didn't hug. They didn't cry. They just sat across from each other in a booth that smelled like old grease and new beginnings. "You're dead," Zora whispered. "The papers said no one survived the explosion." "The janitor died," Elias said. "David Song is still figuring out how to live. It took me a while to find you. The feds kept you tucked away." "You shouldn't have come," she said, though she reached across the table and took his hand. His skin was prosthetic, cold to the touch, but his grip was firm. "The deal was for me to be safe. You being here, it puts us both back in the light." "I know," Elias said, "but I realized something in the water that night. Safety is just another word for a cage if you're alone in it. I spent months in silence, Zora. I don't want to be quiet anymore." They sat together as the sun went down over the capital. They were two broken people, complicit in a history of violence, tethered by a debt that could never be fully paid. Elias Thorne had sacrificed his identity, his wealth, and his body to buy her a life. And Zora had sacrificed her peace to give him a soul. It wasn't a fairy tale. There were still hunters in the world, and there were still nightmares that came in the quiet hours. But as Elias Thorne took a sip of the bitter coffee and looked at the woman who had knocked on his door when no one else would, he realized that some sacrifices weren't endings. They were the price of admission for a second act. "Where do we go?" Zora asked. "Somewhere we don't have to look at the windows," Elias replied. Besties, if this story of sacrifice and the silent debt of kindness moved you, please hit that like button. It's the simplest way to support this channel and ensure these gripping stories keep coming to you every single day. We pour our hearts into these narratives of love and destiny, and we'd love to have you as part of our community. Don't forget to subscribe and comment below. Where are you watching from and what time is it there? I personally read every comment to see how far these stories travel. Until next time, stay kind and remember, sometimes a knock on the door is the start of a whole new life.